Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Brett Parker? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Brett Davis Parker was born in 1970 and lived in South Carolina. In high school, he was active in a few different sports. Eventually, he met a woman named Tammy Jo, and they became romantically involved. She was about 2 years older than Brett. The couple married in 1996 and lived in Irmo, South Carolina, which is 15 minutes northwest of Columbia. They had 2 children, Zach and Brooke. Tammy worked in pharmaceutical sales and was in a band. Brett worked in the medical supplies field. In addition to this work, Brett found another way to make some money. He was a sports bookie. Brett had a few conspirators in his illegal gambling operation. One of them was named Brian Kapnerhurst. Brian was in bad financial shape despite working 3 jobs, and Brett owed Brian over $21,000. Tammy Jo was aware of Brett's criminal behavior. She knew Brian and the other conspirators and may have participated in the operation to a small degree. For example, she may have kept track of money and handed people envelopes full of cash. As far as romance, Brett stayed pretty busy. He had multiple lovers, despite being married. Tammy Jo had also been unfaithful. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On April 13, 2012, Brett used his cell phone to call 911 and reported that a robbery had occurred at his house. He claimed that his wife had been shot to death by his friend, Brian Kapnerhurst, and that he shot Brian in self-defense. So, Brian killed Tammy Jo, and Brett killed Brian. A house surveillance camera captured Brett on his driveway as he was on the phone with the operator. At one point, he laid down on his back, almost near the center of the camera's field of view, as if he wanted to make sure his dramatic reaction was captured. The police arrived and started their investigation. Here's what they found. 44-year-old Tammy Jo Parker was in a bathroom next to an upstairs office. She had been shot 5 times and did not survive. 46-year-old Brian Kapnerhurst was in the attic not far from a safe. He had been shot 4 times and killed. He had a 9mm semi-automatic pistol in his hand. This was the firearm that killed Tammy Jo. Near Brian's body, there was a gym bag containing 9mm cartridges and an empty magazine for that pistol. A surveillance camera on the house captured Brian arriving at 12:31 p.m. that day. He was carrying the gym bag. Here's the story that Brett Parker supplied to investigators. Brian Kapnerhurst came over to his house that day for a meeting. Brett was on the toilet in a downstairs bathroom when Brian arrived, so he told Brian to wait upstairs for him. A few moments later, Brett heard gunshots. When he went upstairs to investigate, he saw Brian pointing a pistol at him. Brian ordered him to take him to the safe. As they went to the attic where the safe was, Brett decided it was time to fight back. He had a .410 bore revolver hidden under a blanket on the safe. Brett retrieved it and shot Brian 4 times in self-defense. Brett Parker admitted that he was a sports bookie and that Brian Kapnerhurst worked for him. This is why Brian was visiting the house. It was on official criminal business. Initially, the police thought that Brett may have been telling the truth about what happened. The scene looked like a robbery gone wrong. Over time, however, they noticed a few items that made them suspicious. For example, Brett had several affairs and told another bookie he was interested in separating from Tammy Jo. The toilet seat in the downstairs bathroom was in the up position, yet Brett said that he was sitting on it when he heard the gunshots. Brian arrived at Brett's house at 12:31 p.m., but the shooting did not take place until 12:42 p.m. The police felt as though Brian would have attacked more quickly. Video surveillance captured Brian putting the gym bag over his shoulder as he was walking into the house, yet the box of cartridges and the empty magazine were on top. Investigators thought that heavier items like that would have drifted to a lower position in the bag when it was on his shoulder. At 12:24 p.m. on the day of the murders, a surveillance camera captured someone looking through the blinds of a door in the house. This was 7 minutes before Brian arrived. Gunshot residue was found on those blinds. On July 20, 2012, Brett Parker was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The state believed that Brett murdered his wife, Tammy Jo, and then waited for Brian to show up for that meeting. He took Brian up to the attic, where he shot and killed him. Brett put the pistol he used to kill Tammy Jo in Brian's hand to frame him for the murder. Brett went to trial and was found guilty of both murders. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 4 months after being convicted for the murders, he was convicted of operating an illegal gambling business. In prison, Brett earned his high school diploma and has worked as a food service aide, dog handler, and laundry worker. Now moving to my analysis. Brett Parker maintains his innocence. At his trial, he claimed he shot Brian in self-defense. He has many supporters who believe the evidence is consistent with Brett's narrative. The state, of course, disagrees. They believe that Brett wanted to get rid of his wife and needed someone to take the blame, therefore he killed Brian as well. This brings me to the question, was Brett guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Brett was a criminal. He admitted to running an illegal gambling operation. He had run up about $170,000 in gambling debts. He owed Brian over $21,000, so killing Brian wiped out that part of Brett's debt. Brett had multiple affairs and told another bookie that he wanted to separate from his wife. Tammy Jo had an affair, which gave Brett a motive for murder. Between life insurance and retirement, Brett stood to gain over $1.1 million from Tammy Jo's death. Gunshot residue was found on the blinds, which were briefly opened 7 minutes before Brian arrived at the house. This makes it seem as though Brett was anxiously waiting for Brian to arrive because he had already killed Tammy Jo and needed someone to blame. In the downstairs bathroom, the toilet seat was up, yet Brett said that he was on the toilet when Brian went upstairs and murdered Tammy Jo. Brett would have people believe that before he responded to the gunshots, he took the time to put the toilet seat up. If Brian's objective was robbery, why would he have killed Tammy Jo upstairs when Brett was downstairs? Wouldn't Brian have been worried about Brett simply fleeing from the house after hearing the gunshots? Why did he believe that Brett would move toward the gunshots? A better strategy for completing the robbery would have been to corner both Brett and Tammy Jo in the same part of the house. Furthermore, Brian knew that there were surveillance cameras outside, yet he did nothing to conceal his identity as he was walking up to the house. How was he planning on getting away with the 2 murders? Brett's thumbprint was on the box of cartridges found in Brian's gym bag, but Brian's fingerprints were not on the box. The gun that killed Tammy Jo was found in Brian's hand, but Brian's forearm had been shot. One medical expert testified that Brian would have dropped the gun after being shot. Why did Brett Parker go outside to call 911, and why did his overly dramatic reaction just happen to occur near the center of the camera's field of view? Brett told investigators that he had originally owned the gun that killed Tammy Jo, but he gave it to Brian about a month before the murder. So both guns used in the killings were owned by Brett at some point. Moving to the exculpatory factors, Tammy Jo took the life insurance policy out on her own. Brett had nothing to do with that. Before Brett was arrested, he had already signed the life insurance benefit over to his children. Tammy Jo earned about $160,000 a year. She was worth more to Brett alive than dead. Brett's story about giving the murder weapon to Brian a month before the murders was supported by his daughter. If Brett really did give away the 9mm pistol, how did he get it back in order to shoot his wife? The pistol was found in Brian's hand, and the quantity of gunshot residue on his hands was consistent with firing the pistol. Brian was about $25,000 in debt, and Brett owed him just over $21,000. Brian had been desperate to set up the meeting to collect his money from Brett. Just a few days before the incident, Brian was talking about how there was $80,000 to $100,000 in Brett's safe. As far as the gunshot residue found on the blinds, this was collected 43 days after the killings. Dozens of police officers had been in and out of the house by that time. It's also possible the gunshot residue could have drifted there through the ventilation system, or it had been deposited long before the murders. One of Brett's attorneys implied that Brett simply was not clever enough to come up with this complex plan to frame Brian. When considering the evidence in this case, do I think that Brett Parker was guilty? Yes, I believe he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Although, I don't believe the state had a great case. There was some doubt here. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Brett and Tammy Jo had high levels of extroversion. They were talkative, outgoing, assertive, and sensation-seeking. In addition, they were impulsive, irresponsible, and engaged in criminal activity. Based on any number of motives, Brett decided that he wanted to murder Tammy Jo. Brett knew the best way to escape responsibility for the murder was to frame someone. Brian was the perfect target to frame because he was in bad financial shape and Brett owed him money. This set up the idea that Brian would come to the house and attempt a robbery. Brett arranged a meeting telling Brian that he was going to settle the debt. He never gave the 9mm pistol to Brian, so Brett had it the entire time. A few minutes before 12:30 p.m., when Brian was supposed to arrive, Brett murdered Tammy Jo. He knew the surveillance cameras outside were recording, but he could not resist the temptation to look through the blinds to see if Brian was coming. He was nervous because if Brian did not show up, Brett was going to have a lot of explaining to do. After all, he just shot his wife using a gun he owned. When Brian entered the house, Brett invited him up to the attic under the guise of retrieving money from the safe. When they reached the attic, Brett produced the .410-bore revolver and killed Brian. He placed the 9mm pistol in Brian's hand and put the ammunition and empty magazine in the gym bag. Brett didn't have to worry about the gunshot residue on his own hands because he was going to admit to shooting Brian. Knowing that his emotional reaction would be closely scrutinized by the police, Brett made sure to stage a dramatic scene in his driveway right in front of the camera. He wanted people to believe that he was upset during the call. Brett forgot that he left the toilet seat up, which almost tanked his perfect plan, but this evidence was ruled inadmissible at trial. It would appear as though Brett had been dealt a royal flush and was once again sitting on the throne. Unfortunately for him, the state had this case in the can, even without using stall tactics. Now moving to my final thoughts. The case of Brett Parker can be summarized in this way. A bungling bookie, bereft of bankroll, brewed a bizarre brainstorm to banish his bothersome bride. The bleak blueprint blamed a bewildered buddy. After blasting both, the bookie billed the blunder as self-defense, but a bypassed bathroom barrier boosted bafflement and brought forth blatant clues. The botched betrayal backfired and buried the bookie behind bars, where he will not bounce back from his bad bet. Those are my thoughts in the case of Brett Parker. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.